Hey everybody, today I want to talk about the Congress of Vienna. This is a meeting in 1814 and 1815 that basically brings the Napoleonic Wars to an end. So in one regard, it's important because it ends the Napoleonic Wars, but in another sense, it basically lays the foundation for peace in Europe for 100 years. Um, there's lots of wars, little wars throughout Europe's history, but from the Congress of Vienna in 1815 until 1914 in World War I, there's not a large-scale major, European war that engulfs the whole continent like the Napoleonic Wars did. So basically, the Congress of Vienna creates 100 years worth of peace. So it's important to remember, kind of as we move towards World War I, some of the stuff that happens here. And when we get to World War I, you'll kind of have to remember some of the things that break down about the Congress of Vienna. But it happens. The meeting takes place in Vienna, Austria. It's basically the major powers of Europe: Great Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, France. You'll notice France does get invited to the peace conference. That's a lot different than after World War I. After World War I, the Germans don't get invited to the peace conference in Paris, so that's one way Congress of Vienna is different than the Paris Peace Conference. The goal is to create a lasting peace settlement after decades of havoc stemming from the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Some of the major players at the Congress of Vienna: Clemens von Metternich, he's the Austrian foreign minister. He's the main guy you need to remember. Remember Metternich. Robert Castlereagh, he's the British foreign minister. Charles Talleyrand, he's the French foreign minister. Tsar Alexander I of Russia is there. Frederick William III of Prussia is there. And let me show you a book real quick. Here we go. If you want to read a book kind of about the end of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna, this is the only book I have on this topic, so I haven't read a ton on this, but it's worth a shot if you kind of like reading more about this. The Congress of Vienna had three principles they were trying to kind of establish: compensation for the victors, restoring legitimacy. Remember, the French Revolution had been about delegitimizing the monarch. Now Europe wants to put that back together, and they want to establish the balance of power. That's probably the most important principle you need to remember about the Congress of Vienna, is the balance of power. The first Peace of Paris in May 1814, this is after Napoleon's first defeat. It's a generous peace towards France. It's not vengeful. France gets to keep their boundaries that they established in 1792. The Congress of Vienna restores the French monarchy. Louis XVIII is put on the throne. Remember, Louis XVI gets killed. Louis XVI's son dies, so there is no Louis XVII. They kind of skip that out of respect for Louis the son that died. The Congress of Vienna is all about conservatism, restoring the old order. And conservatism back then doesn't quite mean the same thing it does today, so don't necessarily think in modern terms. It seems similar in some ways, but other ways it's not. The Congress of Vienna is all about monarchy, religion, the privilege of nobles, etc., kind of the old order. They also want to protect Europe against future aggression from the French. They do some land dealings with the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Prussia receives some territory on France's border. This is called the Sentinel on the Rhine. But the main thing I want you to keep in mind, like I said, the balance of power. This is the international equilibrium of political military power that will discourage aggression by any combination of states or domination of Europe by one nation. Basically, the balance of power is all the big countries of Europe will be so close to each other in strength and power that it's not worth attacking someone else because you're not guaranteed a victory. The only way, the thinking goes, the only way nations really attack is if they have such huge power that they're guaranteed a victory or success if they start being aggressive towards their neighbors. The solution is just make sure nobody's powerful enough to be aggressive. That's kind of their thinking. Compensation for victors. Each state does get some compensation in the form of land. So they're not just altruist at the Congress of Vienna. They do want some of the spoils of victory. Now, Napoleon escapes while the Congress of Vienna is going on. So his whole escape kind of interrupts the Congress of Vienna. His second defeat, Congress of Vienna gets back to work. They restore Louis XVIII for a second time. He had fled when Napoleon came to Paris. France does lose some territory this time. France has to pay reparations. France gets punished with a military occupation for 5 years. You can look at slide 16. That kind of shows some of the land France lost. I've got some cool political cartoons that basically showing the diplomats kind of weighing out Europe on the scales, dividing up the map of Europe. That seems to happen a lot after wars. If you look at slide 19, that's a map of Europe after the Congress of Vienna kind of does its work. So that's what Europe looks like in 1815. There is something that comes out of the Congress of Vienna called the Quadruple Alliance. This is Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. They agree to meet periodically to discuss Europe's common interests and to keep the peace. Sometimes this gets nicknamed the Congress system. This is really important because if all the European leaders are getting together periodically to talk, they're going to start to get to know each other. They're going to start hopefully becoming, good acquaintances. They'll keep the peace. This Congress system starts to break down when World War I breaks out. There's also another thing coming out of the Congress of Vienna called the Holy Alliance. It was proposed by Tsar Alexander I, and this is Russia, Austria, and Prussia, and they just agree if there's ever a revolution, we'll crush it in our own countries. So if there's ever a revolution that pops up in Russia, Austria, or Prussia, we're not going to let it, take root like the French Revolution. We're going to crush it. We're going to kill it before it actually has a chance to harm Europe. Now, there are some revolutions in 1820 that kind of test the Congress of Vienna. Spain and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies forced their monarchs to grant constitutions. The Holy Alliance doesn't like this. Clemens von Metternich doesn't like this. Metternich calls for another conference in Troppau. They established the principle of active intervention. The conservative forces of Europe can intervene in the affairs of other countries to suppress revolution. So sometimes you have the leaders, the old guard conservative leaders of these European countries having more in common with each other than they do with kind of the revolutionaries in their own country. If you're a Austrian monarch or noble, you probably have more in common with a Prussian noble than you do your own Austrian subjects, basically. There's also something that happened a year earlier called the Carlsbad Decrees. Basically, Metternich says the German states must root out subversive ideas in newspapers and universities. There's a lot of talk in the future states of Germany, or the future country of Germany. They're German states right now. There's a lot of talk about, starting a constitutional republic. So the old conservatives kind of want to stop this. And just remember, look at slide 26. That just basically kind of gives you a big picture. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, that's a time of great upheaval in Europe. By the time 1815 rolls around, Europe is tired of change, tired of upheaval. History kind of swings back and forth. Momentum does. Like I said, Metternich is the Austrian foreign minister. He's in there for almost 40 years, so he's there a long time. He has a pessimistic view of human nature. You need a strong central government to keep them in check. So he's kind of a Hobbesian in that respect. He represents the conservative elements in Europe. And I told you not to think of this conservatism of the 1800s necessarily like today's. It's going to sound really similar, but it's actually different in some ways. That'll make more sense once we get to liberalism. I'll explain that later. But The conservative ideology of the 19th century is pro-tradition, pro-religion, and by religion, it's official state religion. The people that oppose the conservatives, a lot of them are still religious. They still believe in Christianity. They just don't want an official state-sponsored version. The conservatives are pro-monarch. They're pro-nobility. They're kind of for the status quo. They argue that social institutions have been around for a long time, so you should respect that. So in some ways, it's similar to modern conservatism, but when we get to liberalism, you'll see how it's not necessarily the same. One of the things Metternich opposes is self-determination. Self-determination is just the right to pick one's own government, or the idea that each people group should have their own country. The Austrian Empire is a perfect example of this. Look at the last slide, 31. Look at how many different ethnicities make up Austria. If you let each one of those ethnicities have self-determination, they would create their own nation, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire would just collapse. I should call it the Austrian Empire. It's not the Austro-Hungarian Empire until the latter half of the 19th century, so I'll explain later on, but right now it's called the Austrian Empire. Towards the end of the 1800s, it becomes the dual monarchy, so it becomes the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but I'll explain that later on. But you can see how if you let each ethnic group have their own country, you would tear the country apart. So Metternich and the old guard conservative forces don't want self-determination. So that's just a little bit on the Congress of Vienna and kind of the conservative beliefs. We'll talk next time about some of the beliefs that challenge conservatism.